Welcome to WikiPodcast. Today we're diving deep into the captivating world of ancient Greek religion, specifically the Greek gods. Were they truly sacred, representing spiritual truths, or were they maybe more like the stars of an elaborate divine drama?
Yeah, it's a great question. And our exploration today, it really draws from a pretty comprehensive look at ancient Greek religion. We're going to try and unpack the core beliefs about these deities,
Their roles and maybe how the ancient Greeks themselves actually saw them, interacted with them.
exactly how they perceive them and, interacted with them. Our aim really is to give you, the listener, a clear understanding of this complex system. We want to highlight the most interesting bits without, overwhelming you.
Right. Get ready for maybe some surprising insights as we explore this ancient world.
Definitely. And maybe one of the first surprising things to understand is that the ancient Greeks didn't really have a single concept or even a word for religion exactly as we think of it today.
Huh. Okay. So it wasn't like this unified system, maybe controlled by one central church or authority.
Not at all. It was much more like a collection of local beliefs and practices. One source nicely described it as almost like different dialects of the same religious language.
Like regional variations. So no central figurehead telling everyone exactly how to worship Zeus or Apollo.
Precisely. Religious life was generally organized at the local civic level. So what's fascinating is we're not looking at one single religion, but more like a cluster of related beliefs and practices that kind of define what it meant to be Greek, set them apart from others.
Okay, that makes sense. And at the heart of all these varied practices was, well, a pretty packed lineup of gods, right? Polytheism on a big scale.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Ancient Greek theology was polytheistic, yeah. A huge cast of gods, goddesses, and then, lots of lesser supernatural beings too.
Yeah, we probably know the main players, the Olympians.
You probably do. The 12 major Olympian gods and goddesses, you've got Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, Athena, Ares, Aphrodite, Apollo, Artemis, Hephaestus, Hermes, and then usually either Hestia or Dionysus rounding out the group.
The Mount Olympus A-list.
Exactly. Those 12 were really central to their religious life, their culture. They pop up everywhere in myths, art, rituals.
And Zeus, he was the king,
Right.
The boss, the ultimate divine decision maker.
He certainly held that position of authority, yeah, king of the gods.
Mhm.
But, and this is crucial, he wasn't all powerful.
Ooh.
Even Zeus was subject to fate. The Greeks personified fate as the Moirai, and their power could actually override even what the gods wanted.
Wow. Okay, so even the guy with the thunderbolts had limits. That's kind of unexpected. And each of these gods, they had their own turf, didn't they? Their specific area of responsibility.
Precisely. Each had their domain. Zeus ruled the sky, Poseidon the sea, and earthquakes, Hades the underworld, Helios the sun, Aphrodite love, and so on down the line.
And they imagined them looking like humans.
Mostly, yes. Visualized in human form, though they could also transform into animals or, natural forces when they wanted to.
Now, this is where it gets really juicy for me. These weren't your typical, flawless, distant, holier-than-thou deities. The Greek gods sound incredibly, well, human.
That's absolutely fundamental. Yes, they were immortal, lived forever, but they weren't paragons of virtue or all-powerful, like we said.
Right.
They experienced the whole range of human emotions, good and bad. And frankly, their behavior could often be pretty questionable, even immoral certainly by our standards today.
Right.
This very human-like view, this anthropomorphism, while it might seem a bit irreverent to us, it probably helped the ancient Greeks understand and maybe even negotiate their relationship with the divine.
How so?
Well, the gods' flaws kind of mirrored human struggles, didn't they? It made them relatable figures. You could look up to them, sure, but they were also kind of cautionary tales sometimes.
Divine drama, like we said at the start. So it wasn't just about solemn worship. There was this whole celestial soap opera playing out above them.
You could definitely see it that way, yeah. They actively intervened in human affairs all the time. They took sides in wars, they had arguments, alliances.
And they even had children with mortals.
Yeah.
The demigods.
Absolutely, leading to all those famous hero stories. And divine conflicts, alliances, these were just commonplace. Think about the Iliad, different gods backing the Greeks or the Trojans.
Okay. And while these big Olympian gods were known everywhere, there was also a really strong local flavor to worship, wasn't there? Like divine hometown heroes.
Exactly right. Certain gods were really strongly linked with specific cities. Athena and Athens is the classic example, right?
Sure.
Apollo with Delphi and Delos, Zeus with Olympia, Aphrodite with Corinth. But it's important to remember, these cities also worshipped other gods too.
Ah, so a city might have its main patron deity, its special relationship, but it wasn't exclusive. They didn't just worship Athena in Athens.
Not at all. And it went beyond just cities. Some deities were even associated with nations outside Greece proper, like Poseidon with Ethiopia and Troy, or Ares with Thrace, which the Greeks saw as sort of wild and warlike.
Interesting.
And another key thing, just because two places worship the deity with the same name, say Artemis, didn't mean their worship looked identical.
How do you mean?
Well, the Artemis of Sparta, the sort of chaste, athletic huntress, was quite different from the Artemis worshipped in Ephesus, who was this multi-breasted fertility goddess figure. Very different aspects.
Wow. So the same god could have really different local personalities almost. That really underlines that decentralized feeling you mentioned earlier.
It really does.
Now, when we think about religion today, often the first thing we jump to is belief. What doctrines do people hold? But for the ancient Greeks, it seems like what they did was maybe more important than specific beliefs.
That's a very important distinction. Ancient sources tell us a lot about Greek religious practices, their cultus, the rituals, the ceremonies. But they tell us surprisingly little about specific doctrines or beliefs, the creed.
So the action spoke louder than words, or rather louder than specific theological points.
In general, yes. What one did, how one participated in the rituals and festivals, was considered much more significant than adhering to a strict set of beliefs.
So going back to that idea of no central authority, it was more about being part of the community rituals.
Exactly. Showing up, taking part, performing the ceremonies, making the sacrifices, that was key. The emphasis was really on the performance rather than, say, internal faith or assent to a doctrine.
And these practices, these rituals, they were often tied into their mythology, weren't they? Those incredible stories about the gods and heroes.
Indeed. The mythology was absolutely vital. It acted as a kind of religious narrative. These stories about the gods, their interactions with humans, the great heroes like Heracles, Odysseus, Jason, Theseus, they provided a framework.
A way to understand the world. And human nature, maybe. And the gods themselves.
All of the above. It explained natural phenomena, justified social structures, explored ethical dilemmas.
And it wasn't just gods and heroes. The ancient Greek world was just teeming with mythical creatures too, right?
Yeah.
Titans, centaurs, nymphs, satyrs.
Cyclops, Scylla, Charybdis, the whole fantastic menagerie. It was a really rich and imaginative mythological landscape.
It really was. And speaking of origins, where did they think it all came from? Did they have one big creation story?
Well, even their creation myths varied, actually. Hesiod's theogony, which starts with chaos as the primordial sort of void/deity, that was a very prominent one, maybe the closest to a standard version.
But not the only one.
Not the only one. And it's just remarkable how this body of mythology didn't just shape their own religious understanding, but as we know, it massively influenced Roman mythology later on.
And kept fascinating Europe for centuries, right through the Renaissance and beyond.
Absolutely. Its cultural impact is just immense.
Now, within this world of powerful, but let's face it, often flawed gods, was there a kind of moral code? What guided how people, and maybe even the gods, were supposed to act?
That's a complex question. One key moral concept you see repeatedly is a strong aversion to hubris.
Hubris. We still use that word, excessive pride.
Exactly. Excessive pride, arrogance, transgression against the gods, or natural order. Pride itself wasn't necessarily bad, but it became hubris when it got extreme or harmful, when someone overstepped their bounds. Moderation, sophrosyne, was generally valued.
Okay, moderation. And interestingly, I read they valued physical skill and intellectual ability pretty equally.
Yes, athletics and intellect were both highly regarded. Think of the Olympics alongside the philosophers. A kind of balanced excellence was the ideal.
So a balanced life, avoiding extremes, that seems key to their ethics.
Yeah.
Now, thinking about the importance of stories and rituals, did they have sacred texts, like a Bible or a Quran?
Not in the same way. The Greeks didn't really have revealed scriptures handed down directly from a god. However, certain ancient texts were held in very high regard. Homer's epics, the Iliad and Odyssey, the Homeric hymns, Hesiod's works like the Theogony and Works and Days, Pindar's Odes, these were considered authoritative.
Maybe divinely inspired.
Perhaps inspired, yes. They often start with an invocation to the muses, asking for divine help in telling the story. But even these texts weren't beyond question. Plato, for example, famously questioned the morality depicted in some of Homer's stories about the gods.
Right, so authoritative, maybe inspired, but not infallible scripture. As it sounds like religious authority came more from tradition, and maybe the priests or sanctuaries, rather than a book.
Precisely. Since practices were locally organized, priests often held civic roles or derived their authority from specific sanctuaries, like Delphi or Eleusis. In the absence of a unified sacred text, tradition carried enormous weight.
People didn't like changing things.
Generally not. Any significant departure from established customs, the patrios nomos or ancestral ways, could cause considerable unease and suspicion.
Okay. And the main ways people actively connected with the divine, day to day or on special occasions, were through ceremonies and sacrifices,
Yeah.
often happening outside those grand temples we always picture.
Correct. The main action usually happened at altars, which were typically located outside temples, often in the open air within the sanctuary precinct.
And what happened to these altars?
This is where ceremonies and rituals took place. People would leave votive offerings, gifts to the gods, maybe small statues, pottery, food, drinks, precious objects, and crucially, animal sacrifice was a central practice.
Right. Sacrifice is something we often associate with ancient religions.
Very much so. Usually, domestic animals, bulls, sheep, goats, pigs were common. There were hymns, prayers, specific rituals for the slaughter, and then usually the edible parts of the animal were cooked and eaten by the participants in a communal feast.
So it wasn't just about giving something up, it was also a shared meal, almost with the divine.
Exactly. The gods received their portion, usually the smoke from the burning bones and fat, and the worshippers shared the rest. Libations pouring out liquids like wine, milk, or honey were also very common offerings.
Okay. And festivals, you mentioned those earlier. It sounds like they were a big part of religious life, too.
Huge. Numerous festivals dedicated to specific deities or to the city-state itself filled the calendar. These involved processions, more sacrifices, big public feasts, athletic contests, dramatic performances, music, the whole shebang.
How often did these happen?
Frequently. Athens, for instance, is estimated to have had something like 140 religious festival days each year.
Wow, that's almost one every 2 or 3 days. A lot of celebrating the gods.
It was deeply integrated into the civic calendar and social life, and these celebrations often took place at sanctuaries. It's important to realize a sanctuary was more than just the temple building.
Right. What else was there?
A sanctuary, or temenos in Greek, was a larger sacred precinct. It was marked off as belonging to the god. It would contain the temple, yes, but also the altar, or altars, maybe sacred groves or springs, sometimes other buildings like treasuries to store offerings, or facilities for athletes or pilgrims.
So the temple wasn't the main place of worship itself.
Not really for congregational worship like a modern church. Early sanctuaries might not have even had a temple building at all. The temple primarily served as the house for the cult image of the deity.
The statue.
Yes, the statue, often housed in the inner chamber called the cella, or naos. Rituals, as we said, happened outside at the altar. Over time, temples also accumulated valuable offerings, becoming almost like treasure houses or museums dedicated to the god.
And some sanctuaries had oracles, places people went for divine guidance.
Yes, certain sanctuaries became famous for their oracles, believed to speak the will of the gods. The most famous, of course, was the Oracle of Apollo at Delphi, where the Pythia delivered prophecies.
Let's talk about those cult images, the statues inside the temples. They sound pretty important.
Oh, absolutely central. These statues were seen as embodying the presence of the deity within the sanctuary. They weren't necessarily worshipped as the god, but they were the focal point for connecting with that god.
What were they made of?
Various materials. Early ones might have been simple wooden figures, Zoanna. Later, you get magnificent works in marble, bronze, terracotta, or even incredibly precious materials like ivory and gold for the really famous ones. Those are called chryselephantine.
Like the famous statue of Zeus at Olympia.
Exactly, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Or Phidias's massive Athena Parthenos inside the Parthenon in Athens. These weren't just statues, they were awe-inspiring representations of divine power and majesty.
And I read somewhere they might even be dressed.
Yes. Some cult images, especially older or more revered ones, might be dressed in real clothes, adorned with jewelry, ritually washed and cared for by priests or priestesses.
Almost like treating them as if they were alive. Now, what about the role of women in all this? We often hear about the male gods and heroes and male priests.
Women certainly had significant roles, though often distinct from men's. The main public religious role open to women was that of priestess, the Hyriae.
And was that an important position?
Yes, priestesses often held considerable social recognition and could enjoy privileges and sometimes even luxuries that other women might not. They typically came from elite families. Some priesthoods required virgins, others married women.
So specific requirements.
Definitely. And they had to be physically healthy and of sound mind, like priests. There were certainly gender divisions. Some deities were primarily served by priestesses, others by priests, and certain rituals were performed only by men or only by women.
Were there women-only festivals?
Yes, there were several important religious festivals exclusively for women, often segregated. The most famous is probably the Thesmophoria, dedicated to Demeter and Persephone. These often focused on themes of agricultural fertility and sometimes served to reinforce traditional female roles within society.
Okay, so while perhaps not equal in every sphere, women had specific and recognized roles within the religious landscape. Now, for people who maybe wanted something more, something beyond the big public rituals, there were the mystery religions, right?
Exactly. For individuals seeking a deeper, more personal, perhaps more emotionally intense religious experience, there were the mystery religions or mystery cults.
What made them different?
They involved secret initiation rituals, the mysteria, that revealed special knowledge or doctrines only to the initiates. Cults like the famous Eleusinian mysteries near Athens, centered on Demeter and Persephone, or the Dionysian mysteries associated with the god Dionysus.
And what do they offer people?
They promised things like mystical experiences, a deeper understanding of life and death, sometimes specific doctrines about the afterlife, maybe even maps or guidance for the soul after death. They also fostered a strong sense of community among the initiates.
So a more personal connection than maybe the big civic festivals provided.
Often, yes. It could be more personal, sometimes more ecstatic, offering a different kind of spiritual fulfillment than the public cults, which were more about civic duty and community cohesion.
Okay, so bringing this all together now, we have these incredibly human-like gods with their dramas and flaws. We have this emphasis on ritual and tradition over strict belief. We have public festivals and private mysteries. Let's go back to our starting question. Were the Greek gods basically just entertaining stories, a kind of sacred soap opera? Or did they represent a genuine spiritual connection, a spiritual truth for the ancient Greeks?
Yeah, it's the core question, isn't it? Considering their often less than perfect behavior, you might lean towards soap opera, but...
But the rituals were taken very seriously. The temples, the sacrifices, the festivals were deeply embedded in life.
Exactly. The answer, as you might guess, probably lies somewhere complex in the middle. It's likely a mix of both. The myths, the stories, they provided this incredibly powerful framework for understanding the world, human nature, why things are the way they are. They offered explanations, archetypes, ways to think about life's big questions.
So the stories served a real function, even if they were dramatic.
Absolutely. And at the same time, the rituals, the sacrifices, the festivals, the prayers they fostered, a very real, tangible sense of community and connection. A connection to the city, to fellow citizens, and yes, to the divine, however human-like those divine figures might have seemed.
It's maybe hard for us to fully separate the narrative element from the spiritual reality as they experienced it.
I think that's right, that the god stories were part of their spiritual reality. Ultimately, these Greek gods, whether you emphasize the divine drama or the spiritual truth, they reveal a culture deeply, deeply engaged in trying to understand the complexities of human existence, partly by projecting those complexities onto their gods.
Okay, so let's think about what this all means for you listening. The ancient Greek gods were definitely complex figures. They held divine power, yes, but also had very human characteristics. Whether you personally lean towards seeing them as celestial drama or as representing profound spiritual truths for the people back then, their stories, and especially the practices around them, they offer this incredibly rich window into the ancient world.
And I think what's really interesting is thinking about how the Greeks managed to integrate these often quite flawed deities into their daily lives, their moral framework. It wasn't necessarily a contradiction for them in the way it might seem to us.
Yeah, that really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About maybe our own modern beliefs and how we handle the gap between the ideal and the very human realities. So hopefully this deep dive has given you a fascinating glimpse into ancient Greek religion, maybe provided some surprising facts, and left you feeling a bit more informed about this incredible and sometimes puzzling ancient world.
Thanks for listening. Write us in the comments your opinion on the episode and what other topics you would like us to talk about. Subscribe to the channel to help us reach more listeners. Thank you and have an amazing day.